Let's explore the geopolitical significance of rare earth metals. Please welcome the panelists. Henk Both, Principal, Anzu Partners. Rutger Van Raalten, co-founder and CEO of CarbonX. Michael Granoff, Managing Partner of Maniv Mobility, and our panel discussion moderator, Beau-Anne Chilla, partner at Forward One. Please welcome to our stage. Round of applause, please. The geopolitical significance of rare earth metals. The floor is yours, ladies and gentlemen.
Perfect. Hi, everyone, for joining us so late in the day. I know we're all eager to go to the drinks, so especially thanks for being here and paying attention to our panel. We have some really interesting panelists today. My name is Beau-Anne Chilla. I'm partner at Forward One, and we're a deep tech hardware investor based in Amsterdam. We're doing seed and Series A. So I'll quickly ask everyone to introduce themselves, including what they know about the subject or their relevance to the subject. And then we'll dive into more in-depth questions as soon as we can. So Henk Both, Principal at Anzu Partners, would you like to start off, please?
Yeah, sure, thank you. Is it on?
I think, can we hear Henk? Say yes.
Okay. There we go. Okay. Sorry, now I can hear it. Hi, I'm Henk Both. I'm a principal at Anzu Partners. Anzu Partners is an industrial technology venture capital firm. We invest in material science innovations, manufacturing innovations, deep tech innovations across a number of verticals, and I lead our energy transition investment vertical. I also lead our office in Atlanta, Georgia. Before Anzu Partners, I got my PhD in physical chemistry from Stanford, so I come to this discussion as a chemist. And then I worked as a management consultant in the energy industry, involved with mineral extraction, material extraction, and kind of international commerce related to that. And then Anzu Partners invests in technology at the seed and Series A stage, and so that means that when we talk about technologies kind of at the forefront of solving these types of problems we're talking about, that's exactly where I like to look for investments.
Perfect, thank you, Henk. Rutger Van Raalten, who is CEO of CarbonX.
Yes, hi everyone. My voice is already cracked from day one, so bear with me. My name is Rutger Van Raalten. I'm co-inventor and co-founder of CarbonX. We develop a drop-in solution for graphite. We produce that locally at full commercial scale, so talking 100 tons per day in US and in Europe. We basically help automotive and battery makers to disconnect from the geopolitical dependency on the graphite supply chain, which shows a high vulnerability, of course, to disruption. So happy to talk from that perspective on the panel.
Perfect. And we have Michael Granoff, who is managing partner at Maniv Mobility.
Thank you. Maniv is a venture capital fund based in Tel Aviv, Israel, that invests at the intersection of transportation and energy. We're a seed stage investor. We have 35 portfolio companies around the world. And just last week announced our third fund, $140 million. We invest really in everything around decarbonization and digitization of the movement of people and goods. I've been around this space for more than 2 decades now, and my original motivation for taking an interest in it had to do with some of the geopolitical imbalances in the energy economy, which 20 years ago was primarily around oil and its monopoly status as a transportation fuel, and OPEC's use of the supply and production to effectively, as I like to put it, tax every person on the planet. And these days we have very different energy security and geopolitical implications in the supply chain for transportation fuels that we'll talk about.
Perfect, thanks so much. And before we dive in depth into a lot of questions we have around these critical resources, I have a silly question of my own, and that is, if we're talking about critical, significant, rare earth materials, are they all metals?
I'm the chemist, so I'll answer that rare earths are all metals, and what rare earths have in common is that they all have, basically, they're used in magnets, so they have magnetic properties. But if you step outside of rare earths, there's a lot of adjacent materials that are also critical materials, and I would put battery materials, contested battery materials in that space, so cobalt definitely, graphite, and some others. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
All right.
No, I can add to that. I recently came from a visit with a cell manufacturer who said the nice anecdote that we're only talking about critical minerals because there's a big monopoly from China, because else we would just be talking about minerals in general. And I think it breaks down to 2 points. One is the demand side, like is this material needed in large quantities? And then the second part is the supply chain vulnerability, I think, which is it easy to disrupt and causing problems? And then, yeah, I fully agree with Henk that there's more than only metals to it.
All right. So, do you have anything to add, or?
I would just say I'm by far the least technical person on the panel, but my observation in general is that those things that are described as rare are rarely as rare as they appear to be.
Ooh, and I think that's a cliffhanger for what's about to come. So let's dive into the first question. So how critical are rare earth metals to various industries, and what specific applications make them indispensable in modern technologies? Michael, would you like to comment first?
Well, you know, they're absolutely indispensable, and we're all here, I think, because we believe that we must transition from a carbon-based economy to a minerals-based economy. But as Tom Sowell has said and observed, I think, very wisely, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And so moving to a mineral-based economy doesn't mean that everything you know, is as benign as we wish it were, but it's definitely the right direction that we have to move in. And as far as, you know, how important it is, it's, you know, there's effectively 3 choices that we could do, right? We could remain in a carbon-based economy, we could transition to a minerals-based economy, or we go back to the Stone Age. And those are really the only 3 options, so we have to decide what we want to do. And I think everyone here is pretty much agreed on what the right path forward is.
I really like how you describe the current economy as a carbonized economy. That's a term I never heard before. Henk, do you have something you'd like to add on the subject?
Yeah, I think being very specific about it, rare earths in particular, as I mentioned earlier, they all have in common the fact that they're magnetic materials. And so if you look and say, you know, are magnets actually critical for anything? There's a lot of things in our world that are essential that aren't possible without strong permanent magnets that use rare earths. And so you go from defense applications like guided munitions need strong permanent magnets, jets need strong permanent magnets made of samarium and cobalt. There are no alternatives to that at this stage. MRIs need rare earths. All electronics, personal computers, phones, tablets, all electronics use rare earths. And electric vehicles, obviously a big driver of growing rare earth demand, as well as wind turbines. So these are applications where, to date, they are completely irreplaceable. And I would say some of those are completely essential.
So I think if I had to summarize, I would say pretty critical. So that leads us to the next question. So to what extent do you rely on rare earth materials for the high-tech industries? And to what extent is it creating vulnerabilities in terms of technology dependence and natural security at the moment? Rutger, what would you say about that?
Yeah, I think it's been mentioned a few times on stage already in the panel sessions. That it's quite critical, and you see that there's no legislation coming. Of course, the Inflation Reduction Act has been mentioned, which is like the carrot, and then in Europe we're trying to be more regulatory with the Critical Raw Material Act. So you see a lot of protectionism coming up, which I think is quite rare for Europe in a way to do that in a joint effort. So I think that is actually a big sign that this is creating really vulnerabilities, and that we have to do everything to basically innovate our way out of the situation that we're in. On the IRA, I think it's interesting that we see from an anode material supplier perspective that sourcing locally is very important in the US, because there's a direct cost benefit. There's a $10 tax credit on the kilowatt hours if you source your material locally, so from the US. As you probably know, more than 95% of graphite is coming from China. So those credits are directly applicable to these clients. In Europe, it's more regulatory, as I said, but I think there's a lot innovation and development going on because of this protectionism that we see coming up. So I think it's a good thing, also pulling innovation alongside.
Yeah, and you mentioned regulations. To what extent are we already collaborating sufficiently within the EU and between the EU and the US?
Between EU and US, it's quite difficult. It's totally different cultures. It's totally different approaches. I mentioned the carrot and the stick. Within Europe, we see that there's quite a supply chain you do as stakeholders together. So we do see in the battery space, from a material perspective, quite some initiatives, companies supporting each other with sourcing of materials. The US is just faster, and I think it was also mentioned in the previous panels. Building a plant in Europe versus building a plant in US, it's about permitting and speed. Same applies for sourcing. So we do see that there's a much bigger pool. But then again, I think that Europe and US are doing basically the same together. It's disconnecting from the monopolies from the East.
Makes sense. Thanks. Michael, what would you add to that?
I think that's very well put. It reminds me of what Winston Churchill said about the United States, which is that they'll always do the right thing after exhausting all other options. And that's really how you can look at the IRA, which I hesitate to use that term since it's nothing to do with reducing inflation, but nonetheless, also about 15 years later than it should have been. But nonetheless, it has been a step in the right direction. There's a huge internal brawl going on now about how to implement it. And Senator Manchin, who was the deciding vote in that legislation, only voted with it on the premise that it would help America stand up the industries, the critical industries, as you said, that it needs to not continue to be dependent for those critical needs on specifically on China. So there's more fireworks ahead, but it seems to be moving mostly in the right direction.
Thanks. That's interesting insight. And so, Henk, which countries or regions possess significant deposits of rare earth metals, and how does geographical concentration impact global supply chains and geopolitical dynamics, according to you?
So it's an interesting question because if you look at the planet as a whole, rare earth metals are pretty homogeneously distributed across the planet and pretty available anywhere. But then if you ask, where are they mined today and where are they processed, the gorilla in the room is China, because 90 to 95% of the world's rare earth metals go through China. And not to make China a boogeyman here, but it's got a pretty tight control over the global supply. And the reason it has that is back in the 1980s, Deng Xiaoping made a statement where he said, the Middle East has oil and China will have rare earths. It's a pretty famous statement. They were willing to double down on mining, extracting, processing rare earths when no one else was, because they didn't care about the environmental concerns at the time. So you bring up radioactive materials, you leach acids and heavy metals into groundwater. It's pretty nasty stuff. You mess up the air quality. So anyway, they made those investments when other countries weren't willing to do that, and they now control the mines. About 60% of the world's rare earths are mined in China, but then they own 90% of the extraction, 90% of the processing, and 90% of the alloying, and they've made it illegal to export any of those technologies. So they've got a very strong stranglehold on those technologies. It takes about 10 years to bring a mine up, from 10 to 20 years to bring a mine up from when you've identified somewhere where you want to have a mine, so it's a pretty long cycle time to get out of that situation. And then kind of the geopolitical concern here is that they have shown a willingness to weaponize that. In 2010, they did that for the first time. They got in a dispute with Japan over some islands whose names I can't pronounce. But they owned 95% of the world's supply at that point. They choked off supply. Prices shot up 20, 30x. So not 2 to 3x, 20 or 30x for magnets that the DOE and DOD have determined as critical. And so the US really at that point started focusing on what do we need to do to get out of this situation. That was 14 years ago, and we haven't really done much.
No, and Do you think, as a society, we feel how urgent the situation is?
It's one of those things where if you talk to people at a party and say, hey, did you know that China controls 95% of the world's magnets? Some people say yes, some people say no. But in my conversations, I've never really had a discussion with someone where I feel like they are treating the topic with the significance that it deserves. Because we all know that Taiwan manufactures a lot of the world's semiconductors, and the US is willing to go to war ostensibly to defend Taiwan from China. Well, they're already in that situation with rare earth magnets. And we're not doing anything about it. We're kind of just trying to play it nice. Last year, they banned exports of magnets to Raytheon and Lockheed Martin over a dispute about Taiwan. Those companies were providing Taiwan with munitions, and so China cut them off, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. They did similar things then with graphite later in the year, so they have shown a willingness to weaponize it, and people don't seem to care. I don't know a different way of saying it. And so that's one of the reasons I'm here, is to try to evangelize and talk about that. But I think it's a much bigger problem than people realize, and it just takes one spark for people to realize all of a sudden.
I see some heavy nodding on my left from Michael.
I'm really glad that you put it the way that you did, and I think you couldn't be more correct, not just about the substance, but about the fact that not enough attention is being paid to this, not enough people are understanding the vulnerability of the West in the current imbalance of these materials. And there have been so many, you mentioned the 1980s, that goes back even further than my recollection. What's seared in my memory is the winter of 2009, when President Obama took office amidst the financial crisis, the bankruptcy of General Motors. Stars seemed to be lining up for the United States to do something dramatic in order to prevent all of the concentration of the new economy around electrification and all the other implications that you mentioned earlier to be dominated by China. But the U.S. failed to do it at that time, and now we're in the position that we're in. And I think the imperative now is to develop new industries. It's also interesting how you said that these materials are basically very well distributed across the world. What's not well distributed is the culture of exploiting them. And there's a terrific book that I recommend if people are interested, called The War Below, by Ernest Schneider, I think, that talks exactly about all of these reasons why so many blockades are put up to mining, particularly in America, and to getting at these minerals that we'll need if we're going to remain competitive in the global economy. I'll also bring out my show and tell, because I like to say that in 1908, when the first Ford Model T rolled off the assembly line in Detroit, people thought that most of the oil in the world was in Pennsylvania. And then the global auto industry exploded, and the market was there, the economic incentive was there, people started finding oil all over the place, and more than 100 years later, found new extraction technologies that took the US from a 40-year decline in oil production to being the world's leading producer again. Now, why do I mention that? Because I think it's going to be the same in this instance, that it's not a factor that it's not distributed evenly, or that we won't have enough. The Stone Age did not end for lack of stones. The oil age will not end for a lack of oil. But we need to find these minerals in other places. So one example of this that I've been spending some time on recently is polymetallic nodules that are on the ocean floor. They are widely across the Pacific Ocean. I've been focused mainly on one particular collection that is around in the country called the Cook Islands. Cook Islands has 15,000 people. It is the land mass is about the size of Washington, D.C., but the territorial water is about the size of Alaska. So it is like 99.99% water. And in their territorial water are trillions of nodules, and I have one with me here today. This here is a nodule from Cook Islands waters that has, I think, about 70% cobalt and 20% manganese and 10% other rare earths. And
is that also how you find it in the sea? Is that
that's
literally?
That's exactly how it comes up, and then it needs to be processed, like if you took it out of a mine in Congo, for example. But I think that these are I think there's a huge economic opportunity with things like this, but there's also a security imperative to balance out the current dominance of Chinese supply.
Maybe a quick follow-up question. Do we actually have the knowledge to process that further up in the value chain?
No, 100%. It's not. It's the processing part is no different than if you took it out of a terrestrial mine.
Interesting. So, and you already touched upon the fact that we can actually be hopeful because we've just identified how critical the situation actually is. When it comes to emerging players, what do you think that will do to kind of the global power balances? How will that shift in the upcoming decades?
When it comes to
like the emerging players, so the new mines that actually the sea. So I'm not sure if we can call that a mine.
Well, a lot of that will depend on policy, and one thing that people should be mindful of is the fact that the Chinese have funded NGOs in order to find problems, and if you see a report come out that says if you lift a single nodule out of the Pacific Ocean, everybody gets cancer, if you see that kind of a report, you should be very suspicious of it, and you should see where it came from. You should see whether it stands up to scientific scrutiny. But I think, like I said, the economic incentive is certainly there, and as long as the politics continues to go in a direction that people continue to understand the imperative to diversify the supply chain, I think this will be a huge opportunity in the next 5-10 years.
And so, thank you, Michael. Rutger, when we're talking about emerging players, I can imagine you have a different view from like a startup perspective.
Yeah, I think, sorry, I think there are basically three pillars we see around us, and I think Henk, I discussed with Henk before as well. I think ESG is a big differentiator for Europe, also US, and part of that is the battery passport, so traceability. That's the second pillar. If we can catch up with China, build enough gigafactories, take care of our supply chains, then ESG and traceability will in the end separate us. But we need to reward that. So for that, we need to have these incentives. And the third pillar is basically localized supply chains. It is critical to, in the end, disconnect. And, well, I think nodules are indeed a nice alternative. I think we have to look at all of them. Consider the footprint, consider the cost, consider the supply chain. But in the end, especially if we focus on EV mobility, it will be mostly about supply and cost. And a lot of developments we see as a startup around us, it's lacking usually one of the two. Most are focused on ESG, so converting CO2 into a useful carbon. It should come at supply and cost. And that's very difficult. And the second part of that is that you also need the funding. I think first of a kind is now the hype in VC land, as I hear. And I agree, you need to go directly to a scale that can be a meaningful solution to the critical situation we're in.
Thanks. So maybe a question to all three of you. So how does the topic influence your day-to-day job or business? So how are you touched by these, well, they're big issues, right? Do you notice you review startups differently, or is it something that you encounter in your day-to-day job?
Yeah, maybe before answering that, just to say one more thing off what Rutger just said. I don't think we've really talked about the scale of the problem yet, so just to quantify it, rare earths, so just for magnets, not even cobalt, graphite, anything else, it's a $45 billion industry today. It's expected to triple or quadruple in the next 10 years. And if you look 10 years out, based on the resources we have available today, the deficit in supply 10 years from now will be larger than the total market is today. So it's an enormous, enormous crunch that we're heading into. It's going to be a $200 billion a year market pretty soon. So what that means for me in my day-to-day as an investor is I'm very, very, very interested in companies that actually show up with differentiated technologies. It's very high on my priority list when I see a company that's a new metal extracting company, refining company, alloying company, recycling company. I spent a lot of my time working at one of our portfolio companies, Niron Magnetics. Niron came out of, this Japan-China conflict that I discussed earlier, the DOE, as a result of that conflict, decided to fund a bunch of research at the university stage in the United States to try to develop magnets that don't require rare earth metals. A research group at the University of Minnesota was the only successful group. They spun out into a company. There's now a company called Niron Magnetics, which is like kind of a pun. Niron is nitrogen, and then iron is the name. They just use iron, nitrogen. They can use scrap iron from car part waste and nitrogen, which is 70% of the atmosphere, and they can make strong permanent magnets. They have, as their investors, anybody you can think of basically in the automotive space, Stellantis, Volvo, GM, they have Samsung, Western Digital, Allison Transmission, Magna, a bunch of companies who are interested in it because of the clear value proposition. So I spent a lot of my time working with that company in particular, but that's just one solution. The market is so large that there's no way that Niron could scale their technology to meet the whole demand. But the crazy part is, I'm also a battery investor, and I've looked in the battery space. There's like, pick your flavor of battery cathode companies out there, but there's literally one company, which is Niron, making magnets that don't use rare earth metals. It's such an enormous TAM. I can't think of another TAM that it's that big that isn't crawling with companies. So long answer, but it's basically what I spend my life on, is trying to invest in this space.
It's actually very hopeful for all VC investors in the room today. Rutger, what would you say?
The startup life, it's been life-changing for us personally. I'm working on this project for more than 15 years. I'm co-inventor of the material, so really part of the team inventing CarbonX in the lab. And we developed basically first for tire industry, making more sustainable tires. That's a completely different conference, different topic. But I think the urgent need, and what Henk says is actually what resonates with us as well, is we were able to actually pivot from going to a sustainable tire where industry is not ready for, changing the settings, changing the grade of our material to basically get similar performance as a graphite. And all of a sudden you're at scale, you're solving at the right cost level, a supply chain issue where there's almost no innovations at scale for this solution. We cannot build more mines easily in Europe. There are roughly a few deposits. Synthetic graphite, you need a lot of energy for a very long time, so you need to find the grids actually to get that from. The raw materials, the feedstock is scarce. So it completely changed our business model and our perspective, and with help of some VCs, we actually got funded last September, raised a round to fully now commit to solving this localized supply chain. So yeah, how important is this? I think it also can be really, in that sense for us, a life-changing event to pivot the whole company towards this as a supply chain solution.
I can imagine. So it's a bummer for all the investors in the room right now because you just closed your round. Is that what I hear?
Yeah, but I'm always raising.
Always be fundraising, right?
Say, the round is never truly closed.
All right, Michael, how about you?
Well, I mean, these guys put it so well. I'll just add that our LP base is made up both of financial and strategic investors, and most of the strategic investors are corporations, many of them around the automotive industry, also around infrastructure and other areas that are, have a huge interest in the success of exactly what you guys were just describing. So, part of our job is obviously our main job is as a fiduciary for our investors to get the highest return, but also to help educate them on how they're going to build cars that that don't depend completely on supply chains that may be out of reach or overly expensive or have other problems with them. And this is exactly the type of knowledge that is going to be critical to be able for everything that all of us are doing to move forward.
Thanks. And if there's one main takeaway you would like to give to the audience summarizing our discussion today, what would it be? Michael, please go first. Yeah.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think the way Henk described the critical situation that I think the West faces right now is important for everybody to internalize and to amplify. But you know, every critical situation is also an opportunity, and that's the important way to look at it. But you know, fundamentally. And I'm optimistic about the future because, as I said, I think this is just a matter of will. We're able to develop the mineral economy that we need for the planet to survive and for people to continue to thrive. And we have to find the right balance in policy and in investment. But I'm confident that we're going to get there.
Thank you. I really liked how you said that minerals are everywhere waiting for the economy to find them, and that there are no solutions, only trade-offs. So thanks for participating today. Rutger, main takeaway.
Yeah, thanks. I resonate with what Michael said, but my takeaway would be that it's first a time to catch up, and innovation will be our way out. I mean, we cannot just copy what happens in China. So the first message for me would be innovate our way out of this mess. And the second way is then just to keep doing what we always have been good at, is innovation, and then try to take over. It's a critical challenge for us. But around us, we do see solutions at scale. So I think focus on scale and cost effectiveness, and then, well, we might catch up and take over.
Innovate ourselves out of this mess and be quick. Skill now. All right, thanks. Henk.
Yeah, I think I think of this whole space in kind of like a three-part framework. And part one is it's a big problem, and you can quantify the problem. Like I said, it's roughly a $200 billion a year market is what we're heading into, with roughly an entire 2024 TAM worth of deficit. So I don't know a better way of saying the scale of the problem than that. And then I think the second part is it's a big problem and it matters a lot. These materials are critical to the way that we operate as a modern society, and they're not replaceable. And then the third part of my framework of how I think about this is very similar to what Rutger just said. You know, I'm a venture capital investor, and so I look for innovation. But specifically, the types of innovation I look for are on the rare earth side. There have to be better technologies, more environmentally friendly technologies for extraction, for refining, for processing, for alloying, for recycling. So there has to be a better way of doing each one of those steps. And there are lots of companies that I can think of that are each playing a step in that. That's kind of an incremental solution. What I really like is the Nairon approach of like think outside the box, develop a completely new chemistry and completely new science of approaching it. And so that's just with rare earths. But if you step back out and you expand the aperture a bit, on the graphite side, synthetic graphites, right? On the battery cathode side, cobalt's here to stay, at least for the next decade or two, because these markets move really fast. But cobalt's not even a critical component of modern battery chemistries anymore, right? You've got NMC, very high nickel NMC cathodes, 811, that use very little cobalt, but then you've got next generation cathodes, LMNO, lithium manganese oxide cathodes that don't even use cobalt, that are very high energy. But then you say, okay, why aren't those deployed at scale today? Well, there's problems with it. There's problems that they degrade the electrolytes because they operate at too high of a voltage. Okay, when I hear that, I think venture investable opportunity. Okay, somebody make an electrolyte that can work with an LMNO cathode, right? And then on the anode side, I mean, we'll go to solid state. Maybe we won't even need graphite at some point. But anyway, because it's a very big problem and a very important problem, that means that the technological solutions I find very compelling, especially if they're differentiated technological solutions, not just incremental steps that are going to get leapfrogged by somebody else.
I love how you see this crisis as an opportunity, really. And also what stuck with me was that you mentioned that the supply crunch in 2035 is going to be as big as the market is today. So that, I think, shows the significance of the issue that we're facing. Thank you all for contributing. Oh, there's a question, actually. Is that all right? We don't have a mic, but if you shout it, I'll repeat it, if that's all right. Yeah?
Why we were facing this shortage stage of the value chain, we're having this worst scenario in the midstream, in the downstream, because I know in the upstream, China controls 60%, but there are lots of mining companies exploiting Brazilian mines in the US or Canada also. So midstream, downstream, which is the worst bottleneck that we are...
Yeah, the availability of rare earths globally is not that much of a problem. The problem is, from the availability side, the problem is that it just takes 10 to 20 years to stand up a mine from when you first start to permit it. So there's a lag time from when you're actually going to start pulling stuff out of it. And then the next step is, I think, what you're asking about. You don't dig up a magnet, you dig up ores, and then those ores need to be processed. And right now, it's a 4-step process. People usually think about it in about 4 steps. So you've got the mining, the extraction, refining, and alloying. Those last 3 steps, 90+% of each one of those steps happens in China. So the odds that you ever touch a magnet that didn't touch China is essentially 0. And the problem is that those are specialized technologies that people have learned to deploy over the years. You can't just fabricate it out of nowhere, and China's made it illegal to export those technologies. And so I actually think that it's kind of all issues need to be dealt with in parallel, because we can't wait 20 years to start producing magnets. But definitely those last 3 steps are much more critical than the first step, the mining.
We might actually have time for one more question. I'm not sure if somebody else has a question in the audience. Okay. I see no hands, so that means we're a little bit...
The hype of an investment on these new technologies for processing metals, do you think it's going to be in this year or in the following, or how do you see the space?
So is your question, when do we expect the VC community to fully embrace the kind of how large the opportunity really is?
Yeah.
I think that the VC community, it's very hard to predict what's going to be trendy. And if I could do that, I'd make a lot more money than I do right now. Just establish secondary positions I could sell. But
the thing is, the VC community does tend to go way over the top on things. And here it's kind of hard to see how that could happen, right? Because the problem is of such magnitude. It's not like what we saw with autonomous vehicles, where in 2016 everybody thought by 2021 owned cars would be obsolete and all be just going around robo-taxis. You know, it's this is a problem that has to get solved, that has the magnitude that you described. So if the hype cycle does kick in, it may be sustainable.
My concern in this space, in terms of hype cycle, is primarily that if a hype cycle does kick in, companies will raise capital at valuations that they can't justify from a technology maturity perspective. And that's not sustainable. So maybe the hype cycle will go for 1, 2, 3 years even, but then you get 3 years down the road and you've raised $300 million of capital and you're on paper a unicorn, but you don't even have a product that works. And that, we've seen that in other industries. And I won't call specific names out, but like in the battery industry, there's companies that have SPAC'd, right, that don't actually have batteries. They're public companies, they're expected to generate revenue, and they generate negative revenue.
I think the fact that we're having a panel on this subject means that the VC community is starting to get aware, and it's a topic of interest.
We started the hype cycle.
Exactly, we started it today. But at the same time, indeed, if you listen about like how large the problem is, and also how big the opportunity really is, I don't see that reflected in deal flow today, personally. So I feel that now is the right time to invest in these solutions. Unfortunately, Rutger, well, he's always fundraising, so. But I expect, like in a year or 2 years' time, this is going to be a hype. That's my expectation. But
maybe I can add as a startup, loving VCs, obviously. I think it's important. There's a certain phase of your company where VC money is probably the most suitable for, and I think talking about critical raw materials, the ticket's going to be large. So I think that is where also the infrastructure, I think, in VC lands probably needs to make a decision on where do we have the funds The fund size should be big enough, especially in Europe. It's lacking, I think, a bit. In US, you have larger fund size to actually support those type of startups. But personally, I do see, and I think Henk and also Michael resonated that, is that there is a lot of attention for this space. But I think the funds probably needs to be adjusted for the size of the risks and the size of the projects that we want to fund.
All right. Thank you so much for your participation today on stage and everybody in the room. If you have any further questions, come find us at the drinks later tonight. All right. Thanks.